Welcome to the Columbus City Schools Student Growth Measures video. This is Greg Mild from the Office of Professional Learning and Licensure. In this video, we will explain how student growth measures fit in as part of the larger teacher evaluation system. We will also explain student learning objectives in detail and show you how to create your own SLO. So let's start with just an overall picture, kind of the big picture of where this comes from. So you've got the Ohio Department of Ed, or excuse me, it's Columbus's version, if you will, of the teacher evaluation system graphic. And as you look at it on the left-hand side, you'll see that there is the performance. That's where principals are coming in, doing observations, walkthroughs, that's your self-assessment. That's everything we started at the beginning of the year with iLead, okay? And for classroom teachers, that composes 50% of an evaluation. For others, what we in Columbus have deemed to be licensed support professionals, that is 100% of their evaluation. That would be guidance counselors, psychologists, TOSAs, okay, nurses. You know, they have essentially no student growth measures. They're not working with students, so they don't have anything on the right-hand side. It is 100% there. For classroom teachers, those who, by law, and I'll cover this, work with students 50% of the time, they have a required student growth measure component. And that composes the next 50% of their evaluation. I'll zoom in on that here. As you look, there are 3 sections of that on the right. And we have taken this version. If you go to the Ohio Department of Ed website, you'll find a model that looks similar to this. We have gone in and made it very specific so it addresses the pieces that Columbus has in place. So at A1 and A2, those both address teachers who have value-added data. So anyone who's teaching grades 4 through 8, math or reading, have a value-added report. Got a teacher-level value-added report in November. Anyone who has value-added data will be doing, as you can see, 1 SLO. Let me talk briefly about value-added data and how it works, because this is also a piece that is misunderstood. So remember that this was adopted by state law, and the evaluation cycle runs through May. However, of course, OAA's given in April, and the results don't come out until summer. And then this year, value-added data didn't come out until November. If you are a teacher who received a value-added report in November of this year, we know it is based on last year's OAA results. However, that value-added report is included in this calendar year's evaluation. The way the model is set up, and because of the timing that the state put on it, essentially that value-added data will always be a year behind, okay? So every November, if you get a report in November, that is this component, that is this value-added, when it talks about value-added in the Columbus evaluation system, that is the value-added data that it's talking about. So essentially, even if you're no longer teaching math and reading, if you taught 4th grade last year, this year you're down at 3rd grade, you're not teaching a value-added subject. Because of that value-added coming from last year, that goes into this calendar year's evaluation. So that's the first 2 areas are about value-added. If you've got value-added, you're doing 1 SLO. Notice section B, the state put in a provision that if you use what they call, we'll call it an ODE-approved vendor assessment. And so there's a list of assessments from assessment companies. I'll use Terra Nova as an example. And there is also parameters. It's not just that you do Terra Nova, it's that you have to do Terra Nova in a way that would identify student growth from one point to the next. If you do, and there's again a variety of assessments. In short, here in Columbus, we do not implement any of those vendor assessments in the manner prescribed by the state. Okay? So you'll see in that box, and the requirement from the state is if you do use one of those, then you are required to use it as part of the teacher evaluation. Columbus does not administer any of those in that in that manner. So you'll look at category B, we will have no teachers that applies to this year. And then C is, again, goes down to the simple one. Teacher instructs no value-added subjects. So if you do not do any value-added subjects, you do not teach grades 4 through 8 math or reading at all, you will do 2 student learning objectives. That is the majority of teachers in our district. Only about 600 teachers in our district received value-added reports. The remainder did not. So the majority of teachers will be doing 2 student learning objectives. So that's this whole side of the chart is student growth measures. So student growth is defined by essentially the change in student achievement for an individual student between 2 or more points in time. So point A, student knows this. Point B, student knows this. You compare, student grew in knowledge, demonstrated knowledge based on some sort of assessment. That demonstrates student growth. The traditional, right, that we think of this as is that value added, which is from, 4th grade OAA to 5th grade OAA. It's over the span of a year. But that's value added. That's based on OAAs. Student growth can occur over a variety of period of times. It can occur over a period of a week, a month, a year, multiple years. Okay? Student growth isn't specific to the Ohio Achievement or any standardized assessment. It's based on, if you give any kind of pre-assessment and post-assessment, you're measuring what those students knew from one point to the next. That is student growth. This is, for those interested, and a reminder, why are we doing this at all? Why are we doing this at all in our district? It is a part of state law. It was adopted. Here's the little section of it. You've got that. And again, it requires any teacher who spends at least 50% of the time employed providing student instruction then has student growth measures. Is required to have student growth measures as part of their evaluation. And this is essentially the first year this has really come into play as the entire evaluation, and so that's why we're obviously doing it this year. This slide's in there again, gives you some examples. You've got value added, you've got approved assessments, and the last one is where we in Columbus opted to go with this SLO model that we're going to talk about. There are different ways to show local measures and things like that. Specifically, in Columbus, the evaluation team and then subsequently the evaluation panel adopted the model of SLOs and SLO creation that is the basis for what we're talking about today. And it is very heavy on putting the individual responsibility and giving teachers autonomy to create SLOs. That's a phrase we'll keep coming back to, is that idea of professionalism and autonomy. This really gives teachers many, many individual freedoms in the SLO creation process. Value-added results are added in to a teacher's, and it is math and reading, again, as we talked about, 4 through 8. And you'll see it's a 1, 2, or 3 year, what they call a rolling average. As an individual teacher, when you get a report, and this goes for schools, buildings, districts, the value-added data report is always based, and it's called up to 3 years worth of results. So if you come in and you think about that, we talked about that. If you're a first year teacher, okay, that first year, even if you're teaching, let's say you're only teaching 6th grade math. First year teacher, you have no report, no data from last year, so you're one of those teachers who has no value added for the current year. Seems kind of, a little bit of a disconnect, but essentially because of the timing, there's no value added for that teacher. The following year, teacher stays, just follow this example through, they're always teaching 6th grade math. Their value added data is based on 1 year, okay? You get 1 year of data. The following year, they add that second year in, and it's a composite, combines those first 2 years. The following year, 3 years, they combine all 3 years for that teacher's rating. The following year, that teacher now has 4 years of history with value added, but that very first year falls off. So now it's just the past 3 years. And every successive year, it's always up to 3 years. Another piece of that with value added goes with if you switch subject areas. If you do math and reading, they also, let's say you do 5th grade math and reading, you get 2 different value-added reports. They combine it into a single final rating. They combine how your students did on math, how your students did on reading, and combine it. That would carry over also for up to 3 years. This local measures Columbus's position with this, Columbus's position with the value-added percentages, and Columbus's position of value-added as 1 SLO, non-value-added as 2 SLOs. Those are all local decisions. So if you have friends in other districts, their process could be very different. And so it's kind of just important to keep that in the back of your head that talking to someone else from another district and they say, no, that's not how you do it. Well, that may not be the way they do it, but Columbus had the decision, hey, this is how we do it. And so even though it's based on a state law, there were certain segments of it that gave districts flexibility. And I'll say Columbus absolutely jumped on that flexibility to do so. So an SLO is a measurable, long-term academic goal informed by data that a teacher or teacher team sets at the beginning of the interval of instruction for all students or for subgroups of students. So we talked about, do all classroom teachers need to write SLOs? What's the answer to that? Yes. How many? 1 or 2. Right, 1 or 2. So we talked about, obviously, you will write 1 or 2 regardless of category. If a teacher has value added, they're doing 1. Teachers without value added will do 2.
From the ODE, this is really the technical term for why we're using SLOs or the ODE's stance. It does reinforce promising teaching practices. When you look at what an SLO is, it's a unit of instruction, basically. It is good teaching. Okay, no one can argue that. It is a good practice. It can be used in all subjects and content areas, and it's adaptable. It's very adaptable. As Greg said, this really promotes teacher professionalism and autonomy. Okay, and we want to continue to promote that.
A couple of things, and that we'll reinforce throughout the day, is this idea of collaboration. And especially when we talk about some of the components of the SLO, we will strongly advocate for collaboration. In the same way that you're working, in that concept of with TBTs, working on short cycle assessments, looking at data, we don't want you to feel, any teacher, to feel as though that you have to work on an SLO in isolation, because you simply don't. And truthfully, if you work with someone else, at least in some sort of feedback loop, it's going to be easier, and I think you'll feel more comfortable in the process working together with someone. And I think it'll go much smoother. If this were a detective show on TV, some Law and Order episode, or if this were an Indiana Jones movie, this would be what they would be searching for. Okay? And when they found this, the episode would wrap up tightly in that last 10 minutes, and everyone would go, oh yeah, it's him. This is it, okay? This is the key to SLO writing, the SLO checklist. So let me show you what this has on it. First of all, I'll point out, as we've done with other things, at the top, it's the SLO template checklist for Columbus City Schools, okay? I'll point out one significant change from ours versus the one that if you downloaded it just straight from the state website. But let me tell you what this has. The SLO, Student Learning Objective, has 7 components, and those are represented by those 7 columns. You'll see the titles, first one being baseline and trend data, followed by student population, goes all the way over to rationale for growth target. So 7 pieces of an SLO. The second box, that second row, is basically a descriptor of what that is. So if you look at under student population, you say, okay, what do I put in the SLO for student population? It describes it there, which students will be included in this SLO, include course, grade level, and number of students. That's what you would include. So then you say, how do I know How does anyone know if an SLO is written correctly? It comes down to that third column. Notice it's a series of check boxes. It's not a rubric. It's not a grade. It's not saying you get a 3 out of 4. I'm reading what you've written and I'm scoring it 3 out of 4 on quality. It has to do with completion. So if I go over to, I'll say interval of instruction, so I don't have to read a whole lot. And this is also the one that is the most significant change. And we'll talk about it as we get there further. But notice under interval of instruction, there's one checkbox. How do I know if I've written my interval of instruction correctly? You look at the checkbox and say, have I written it, and does it match the interval of instruction of the SLO? Yes, no, check. I will know when my SLO is written properly when I can go through it and I can check all these boxes. Okay, it really is that simple. And that's why this piece of paper, and this is also available on our website, this is the piece of paper that any discussion you might have with another teacher, any discussion we will have with another teacher, always falls back to the checklist. Dun, dun, dun. Think about a concept of something you're going to look at, something you're going to be teaching in the course of instruction to your students over the next couple of months. This isn't asking you to create something new, to teach something outside of the scope of what you're already teaching. This should integrate cleanly into a unit or units or period of time, period of instruction that you're doing over the next couple of months. The first component of the SLO that we will look at is baseline and trend data. To complete this component, the teacher should write what information is being used to inform the creation of the SLO and establish the amount of growth that should take place within the time period. In writing the SLO, the teacher should identify the source and summarize student information in numerical and narrative form. The SLO should draw upon trend data if available, and it should summarize an analysis of data by identifying student strengths and weaknesses. Here we see a sample of a baseline and trend data SLO. Notice that this teacher is working with first grade reading. They used the results of running record assessments to write this SLO. There is a narrative at the beginning that describes the baseline and trend data used. Then the teacher reports the results of that trend data and describes some specifics in the lower bullets. The next component of the SLO is student population. This component describes which students will be included in the SLO, and it includes the course, grade level, and the number of students. It's important to note at this point that an SLO does not need to cover every student in a teacher's class. To complete this, the teacher should identify the students covered by the SLO, describe the student population, and consider any contextual factors that may impact growth. And this does not exclude subgroups of students that may have difficulty meeting targets. However, if any students or subgroups are excluded, the teacher should explain why those students are excluded if they are not covered in the SLO. Here is a sample SLO for student population. In this SLO, the teacher covers all 57 sixth grade science students, which she reports as teaching in first and second periods. The teacher continues and points out that in that population, there are 7 IEP students, there are 2 504 students, one with ADHD, one with a hearing impairment, and there are 7 gifted students. The teacher also points out that in this case, any students with 45 or more excused or unexcused days will be excluded from this final rating. The third component of the SLO is the interval of instruction. In this component, the teacher identifies the interval of instruction that the SLO will cover, including the beginning and end dates. The interval of instruction is the period between the administration of the pre- and post-assessments. The teacher should consider adding the following information also: how frequently the course meets, the typical length of a class period or period of instruction, and any other relevant information regarding the interval. In the sample, you can see that the teacher identifies that this is a year-long course taught in one 41-minute period per day. The SLO interval of instruction begins on February 7th and ends on April 15th. Note that the interval of instruction does not need to be the full course, a full quarter, or a full semester. It simply needs to represent a beginning and end time. Many teachers will focus and center their interval of instruction around a single thematic unit. The fourth component of the SLO is titled Standards and Content. This component identifies what content the SLO will target and to what related standards the SLO is aligned. Notice to complete this section, it simply needs to specify which standards the SLO covers. And this should represent the big ideas or domains of the content. This will also identify the core knowledge or skills students should attain if the SLO is targeted. You can see in this sample SLO for standards and content that the teacher identifies the following standards from the Common Core State Standards at the top and lists the specific standards. At the bottom, the teacher paraphrases or summarizes those standards in narrative form. The next component of an SLO is the assessments. In this component, the teacher identifies what assessments will be used to measure student growth for the SLO. Selecting and approving assessments is a challenging and important step because those assessments enable teachers to determine growth toward and attainment of the SLO. The Ohio Department of Ed strongly recommends that assessments are not created by one teacher, and the district recommends that teachers work in teams to help each other identify appropriate assessments. Finally, Columbus respects the professionalism and autonomy of staff in the selection of assessments. Good assessments to measure an SLO have three key factors. First, the assessment should align to the content and rigor of the SLO. Teacher wants to ensure that the assessment is aligned to the content to appropriately measure growth. Second, the assessment should have enough stretch to allow both high and low achieving students to show growth, and should include questions of varying difficulty and complexity. Third, teacher wants to ensure that the items are clear, concise, and include appropriate vocabulary in order to properly measure what the SLO is targeting. In the SLO, the teacher should identify valid and reliable assessments. The teacher should describe how the assessment provides stretch for both low and high achieving students. If multiple tests will be combined into a single score, the teacher should provide those specific details. It's important for teachers to remember that an assessment does not necessarily have to be a paper and pencil test. Assessments come in a variety of formats, from performances to rubrics to products that a student might produce. Assessments will also look different across various content areas and grade levels. A teacher at the early primary grades would not necessarily give a paper and pencil test to young students to have them identify shapes. In that way, that test would be more of a reading test. Additionally, students in the arts might have performance-based assessments. The individual teacher is ultimately responsible for identifying and/or creating, if necessary, an assessment that aligns to the content of the SLO and that will be able to properly measure student growth. SLOs can be created by drawing on different data sources. They can use district department identified assessments. They can use assessments that were identified or created in a PLC or TBT process. And certainly they may use teacher identified or created assessments. The next component of the SLO is titled Growth Targets. The teacher should complete this considering all available data and content requirements, identifying what growth targets each student can be expected to reach. Remember that student growth is the change in student achievement for an individual student between 2 or more points in time. With that, it's important to note then that all students in the SLO's identified student population will have an individual growth target. The growth target will refer to the baseline and/or pretest data. The teacher should set developmentally appropriate targets for each individual student. Teachers should also provide tiered targets to encompass all learners, and the targets should be ambitious yet attainable. Finally, the teacher should establish the rationale for those growth targets by answering the question, what is the rationale for setting the targets for student growth within the chosen interval of instruction? In this section, the teacher should demonstrate their knowledge of the students and the content, explain why the targets are appropriate, how they address student needs, use data to identify those student needs and determine appropriate targets. The rationale should also align with broader school or district goals and should mention how it sets rigorous expectations for the students and the teacher. When a teacher is ready to write up and submit their final SLO, it is done so on the iLead website. Assessment leaders will use the SLO checklist to determine whether an SLO is complete and will either approve it or return it for revision. The initial SLO review process will occur in February. An SLO needs to be completed by April to meet the state-required deadline of submitting final results by May 1st.